or someone older than us, someone wiser than us, someone who has a better definition of justice. So, yeah. I came here to talk about how change happens, and we've touched on that. That these types of structural changes that when we look back, we say these things were positive. They've come about through people struggling. They've come about through social movements, not just people working as individuals, but people agitating, educating, and organizing. All of the examples, practically all of the examples, even recycling, to bring that in on an institutional level, has been a struggle. And it has demanded that people build momentum, develop a strategy, find out who the decision makers are, and how to influence them. So when I was 17 and thinking about becoming a progressive lawyer and working for change that way, and I had my world turned upside down, hearing the word ecocide and the term biological meltdown, I became passionately interested in the issue of change and how change happens. And I also felt like I didn't have decades to figure it out, that I had to learn through doing. I started saying, who do I know? Who do I know that has made change? I started reading biographies of King and Gagne and Malcolm X and Petra Kelly of the Green Party in Germany and all of these different people, and finding out their theories of change and what had worked and what hadn't. And I really liked coming across Gandhi's autobiography because his title for it was My Experiments with Truth. And I decided to start actively experimenting. And the same teacher that I told you about who taught the philosophy of law class, I'm indebted to her because the next semester she taught a class called The New Revolutionaries, talking about the social movements that are going on now around the world. And that's where I found out that Gandhi's definition of revolution wasn't just changing the faces of the power holders, changing who's in power, but changing the nature of power. Fairly abstract. So let me get very concrete. When you walk out of the room today, I'm going to invite you to do it for a couple of minutes in as much silence as you can muster. Why? You ever heard of a Native American sweat lodge? Some people call it purification lodge. Yeah. It's a pretty intense religious ritual where you go into something that's shaped like a womb. It's on the earth, and it historically was made with sticks and skins over it. And you would go in for spiritual purification and to get in touch with your inner guide. Your way of knowing, I'll say your inner guide, your who you are. That's what a sweat lodge is about. And that's what a lot of traditions around the world are about. I love speaking to people who are in the ages of 15 through 17 through 18. You know why? Because I think it's the most psychologically exciting age. It's the age in which people are most ready to experiment with social change. And if you look anthropologically, if you step outside of this culture, you find that most cultures around the world have had something called rites of passage. Rites of passage for 15 to 18-year-olds that invites them to become full members of the community. In this culture, we have this really prolonged adolescence and youth, right? Where we don't feel like full adults, most of us, until we're in our 30s or 40s, and some of us aren't even certain yet. In many other cultures, you had rites of passage that you were welcomed as a full member with all the privileges and all of the responsibilities. And part of the way that has happened is inviting people to do something called a vision quest. To go out into the woods, sometimes for several days, and not talk to anyone, but to get in touch with that voice within. To seek a vision of who he or she was as an individual, and also what they wanted to bring to the world. So if I said nothing else today, I invite you, when you walk out of here, the reason I brought up sweat lodges is because you're encouraged not to talk about the experience for several days. because it's still working on you. When you walk out of here, when I walked out of the class, having heard the word ecocide for the first time, I wasn't able to talk with anyone for a while. And in that time, I made a decision about the direction of my life. I made some commitments. I found my vocation, my calling. The reason I'll ask you to be silent is just to think about whether you want to explore these ideas more, because this is a very small period of time in which to talk about the state of the world and how change happens. But if you think these ideas are important enough, then I'm going to invite you to make a few commitments. Or here are some commitments you might make. 1, start reading things that you don't have to read for school and that aren't just fun, but start studying how change happens in a focused way. For me, some of that was just going to the library. Follow up with opportunities, experiment actively. And I mentioned the teacher who taught a class called The New Evolutionary. She brought in a trainer, a guy who taught nonviolent direct action, who worked with peace groups around the world. And he taught us the Gandhian method of satyagraha, soul force, active nonviolence. I mention these things just to plant some seeds, because if we're going to change directions as a culture and move toward ecological balance, we're so far out of whack right now. And we're so far from peace as well. We live in a country that's embroiled in a few wars, and most of us don't even think about it. Most of our parents don't think about it on a day-to-day basis. We kind of go to the club. Right? We sometimes focus on the crisis that's closer to home, whether it's in our neighborhoods with gun violence, or it's a financial crisis affecting our retirement, or what have you. I think it's worth being here. I think it's worth you thinking about this, because historically, a lot of social change has come from youth, has come from people recognizing that we need to think outside the box. It's an overused phrase, but when I was 17 and I looked around at our so-called leaders, elected officials, etc., they weren't even talking about real sustainability. How many people think you can have infinite growth in a finite system? Raise your hand. Sounds absurd, right? And yet, do you know that the primary way we measure the health of our economy is looking at those three letters? GDP, which is all about growth, right? If growth happens, if the GDP increases, it's a good thing. Do you know that oil spills increase the GDP? And manufacturing nuclear weapons increases the GDP. War increases the GDP. So all of these things, according to how we measure the health of our economy, and we even measure the health of our society this way, it's a pretty absurd model. There are other ways of evaluating out there. But so I found this out when I was 17. I said, we're not even talking about moving toward real sustainability. So I invite you when you leave the room to do the following. Be quiet for a few minutes. Think about whether these are questions you want to explore. If you do, get in touch. And the website for the Peace Museum is www.envisionpeacemuseum.org. You can follow up with me directly. Send me an email, director@envisionpeacemuseum.org. And the exciting thing about today is that there are so many opportunities for getting involved in very powerful ways. When I started out at 17, I wasn't sure where to start, and so I contacted the one environmental group that I knew, a group called Greenpeace. You've probably heard of it. And I started working for them a few weeks later. These days, there are all kinds of neat internships, training programs. It was mentioned that I did something called Green Corps, which is a 13-month, really intensive fellowship for people who want to learn social change skills. There are many learning opportunities, but we're all going to need to make a few fundamental decisions. One of them is whether we take some responsibility for the state of the world. Most of the people in this room will decide to take some. The next question is how we're going to channel our energy. And I'm going to just pick a bone with one word, which is service. Okay? We've got the Martin Luther King Day of Service coming up. And I've studied King. I have tremendous respect for him and so many of the people in the civil rights movement, people who are horrified at the loss of memory, the collective memory loss, like the way we now understand service. King wasn't just about service, and the civil rights movement was not just about service. It was about social change. Service is someone's hungry, you give them a fish, right? Give them food. Social change is asking why they have no fish and helping people develop the skills, develop the capacity to change systems. King, in addition to working on civil rights, worked against the Vietnam War. And when he started to focus on the Vietnam War, he said that the US government is the biggest purveyor of violence on the planet. Do you know why King said that? And he talked about taking on the triple evils of extreme materialism, militarism, and racism. King was something, and I used the word before, King was a radical. Who can tell me what radical means? Right. To go to the roots. So I mentioned that. When we use it in this culture, we usually equate it with extremism. But King was someone who believed in going to the root, and he invited other people to do the same. So when you walk out of the room, it won't just be a question of whether you take responsibility. It will be a question of whether you try to get to the root of the problem or deal in band-aids. Recycling is great. I think that all positive movement towards sustainability and peace is important, but it doesn't change our direction. I'll just mention a couple of resources before I stop, and then invite you to follow up with me. So one, the Peace Museum website, envisionpeacemuseum.org, I mentioned that. Two is training programs for people who want to explore these skills. greencorps.org is another one. Three, get in touch with me directly, director@envisionpeacemuseum.org. Four, there are some amazing web resources out there for people who want to start exploring solutions. One of them is grist.org for environmental issues. The tagline for it is a beacon in the smog, and it's all about solutions. Another amazing resource is called Yes Magazine, yesmagazine.org. It looks at is very solution focused, and it's where peace, sustainability, and justice come together. Those are just a few, but one thing I've learned over the years is the value of following your heart and doing follow your nose research. So trust your gut, go on your vision quest, experiment boldly with solutions, talk to people, ask questions, ask uncomfortable questions, explore the roots, and work together. Because social change isn't about just individuals making changes in our households or just using, the proper water bottle, which is all great, but it's groups coming together. And walking through this school, I'm blown away. It's a beautiful school. I have a 3-year-old daughter. She's in a great school, but this school has me thinking about the power of an all-girls education. One thing that we all need to do as North Americans, though, is to come to grips with our tremendous privilege. Right? Tremendous privilege in global terms. Many of us, tremendous privilege in North American terms. And decide whether we're going to take our place in the status quo the way it is, or become an agent of change. I invite you to do the latter, and I really hope that we all do the latter for our own good and for future generations. So thank you very much for having me.